My name is Meredith Cole. I'm 33. For the last 5 months, ever since my mother's stroke, Sunday dinner at her house had become the 1 hour a week I could confirm she was still eating, still steady on her feet, still herself. I brought a folder with her medication schedule updated in my own handwriting, because the pharmacy kept switching her generic brands and no one else seemed to notice. I sat at the same end of the table I'd sat at since I was 9, and that night, before I'd even unfolded my napkin, my brother tapped his glass with a fork like he was about to announce an engagement. "Bianca and I have been talking," Grant said, "and we think it's time somebody took real charge of Mom's affairs. Somebody stable. Somebody with a house, a spouse, a plan." He smiled at our mother like he'd just given her a gift instead of a verdict. "We're going to start handling her paperwork properly from now on." Nobody at that table asked me what I thought. Nobody asked my mother what she thought either, though she was sitting close enough to reach if she'd wanted to say something, and she didn't, and I noticed that, filed it away the way I filed everything. I set down my fork. "Mom already has someone handling her paperwork," I said. "She has for years." Grant laughed the easy laugh of a man who has never once had to read an insurance denial letter out loud to a person recovering from a stroke. "Come on, Mer. Bringing her prescriptions in a folder isn't a system." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't correct him further. I looked at my mother, who was very carefully studying her water glass, and something in the careful way she wasn't looking at me told me this conversation had already happened once before, without me in the room. I picked up my purse. I kissed my mother's cheek. I told Grant I hoped Bianca's paperwork included patience, because our mother's medications didn't run on anyone's convenient schedule, and I left before anyone could turn my calm into a performance they got to referee. I did not know yet what my brother had already asked her to sign. I did not know that 4 days later, a stranger at my mother's credit union would slide a folder across a desk and say a sentence that would end my brother's plan before he understood it had a name. I only knew, driving home with both hands steady on the wheel, that somebody stable was a strange thing to call the person who had been showing up for a decade, and that my brother had just described a job that already belonged to someone. He simply didn't know that someone kept records. 4 days later, in a credit union conference room with beige walls and a bowl of peppermints nobody touched, my brother's confidence would come apart in under 6 minutes. He didn't know that yet. Neither did I. Not exactly, though I'd started to suspect something was moving faster than family dinners usually move. What I did know, sitting in my car afterward that Sunday night, engine off, driveway empty, was that the last time anyone in my family used the phrase, "somebody stable," to describe a job that needed doing, it was my own father, 6 years earlier, telling my mother in that same driveway that I was the only one of his children he'd trust to handle things, if it ever came to that. He died 4 months later, suddenly, and it did come to that, and it would take my mother's grief, not his foresight, to finally put any of it in writing. Before I tell you what happened in that conference room, and what was actually sitting inside a folder my brother didn't know existed, tell me, what time is it right now, where you're watching this from? Where in the world are you tonight, and what's the weather like there? I like knowing how far a story like mine ends up traveling, especially this one, because it started at a dinner table small enough for 4 people to reach across and touch hands, and it ended somewhere much larger than any of us expected. Let me introduce the people who were at that table. My mother, Eleanor Cole, 66, a retired school teacher who spent 30 years correcting other people's children and somehow never quite learned how to correct her own. My brother Grant, 36, a real estate agent with a good haircut and a business that had been quietly bleeding money for longer than any of us knew. Grant's wife, Bianca, who ran his marketing and his social calendar and, I'd later learn, one very important phone call to a notary who owed her a favor. And my father, Walter, who wasn't at that table at all anymore, except in the fact that his absence was the reason any of this started. Here is what my family had already agreed, without ever saying it out loud, to stop remembering. My father died 6 years ago, suddenly, on a Tuesday afternoon, in a hospital hallway 2 floors up from the unit where I happened to be finishing rounds with a discharge team. A nurse found me first, because I was already in the building, the way I always seemed to be already in the building whenever this family needed something urgent handled. I called Grant from a small family consultation room with beige walls that would, years later, remind me uncomfortably of a credit union. He'd been on a golf trip with 3 friends he'd been planning for months, a trip he later described, in front of both of our parents at a holiday dinner, as genuinely one of the best long weekends I've had in years. He arrived home the next morning, nearly a full day after the time of death, furious that no one had reached him sooner, as if grief were a meeting that could be rescheduled around a flight change fee. I planned the funeral. I found the life insurance policy in a fireproof box my father had shown me once, years earlier, almost as an afterthought, the way you'd mention where the spare key was. I filled out the paperwork for my mother's survivor benefits because she couldn't look at a government form without her hands starting to shake, and I told myself that was grief, and not something else, something that had already been happening for years, and simply had a new excuse now. For a decade before that, it had been smaller things, the kind that don't sound like anything when you say them out loud individually, and sound like a pattern only when you finally stack them. I was the one who drove 40 minutes each way every other Sunday, first to see my parents, then to see my mother, because Grant's house was closer, and his excuse was always that his schedule was just so much less flexible than mine, as if hospital case management ran on some kind of lenient honor system. I was the one who noticed when my mother started reusing the same 3 excuses for why she hadn't filled a prescription. I was the one who sat with her through the first 3 days after her stroke, translating her own words back to her when the right ones wouldn't come, while Grant visited twice that week for what I clocked, without meaning to, at 11 minutes and 14 minutes. And every time anyone outside our house asked how my mother was doing, my brother had a version of the answer that always started with we. We're managing. We've got a good system going. We check in on her constantly. I did not correct him in front of other people, because correcting him in front of other people had never once, in 30 years, changed anything except how he treated me for the following month. I corrected the pill organizer instead. I corrected the insurance appeal instead. I corrected, quietly, one document at a time, and I told myself that eventually, somebody would notice the shape all those corrections made. I think about one afternoon in particular, more than I probably should. From the fall I was 19, and Grant was 22. The year he dropped out of his second college in 3 years, and moved back into his old bedroom, as though it had been waiting for him. Which, in fairness, it had. I had just been named to the dean's list at my own school, a fact I mentioned once, briefly, at dinner, the way you mention something you're proud of, and immediately regret mentioning because of how quickly the room moves past it. My mother said, "That's wonderful, sweetheart," in the tone she used for weather updates, and then spent the next 20 minutes discussing, with real feeling, whether Grant's most recent setback meant he needed a semester to find himself, or a change of environment entirely. Nobody suggested I might also, at 19, have benefited from either. It did not occur to anyone, including me, that steadiness was not the same as not struggling. It had simply never been treated as interesting. I did not resent Grant for that, not exactly, not for a long time. I resented, if I'm being precise about it, the specific arithmetic my parents seemed to run without ever announcing it. Struggle, in my brother, was treated as a phase requiring patience and support. Struggle, in me, when it showed up at all, was treated as an inconvenience I was expected to manage privately, because I was the one who was supposed to be fine. I got good, over the years, at being fine. I got good enough at it that by the time I was 33, sitting in a family kitchen while my brother explained that somebody stable needed to take charge, some old, buried part of me almost laughed, because stability, in this family, had never once been rewarded. It had only ever been assumed, the way you assume a bridge will hold simply because it always has, right up until the day you finally ask an engineer to actually look at it. It also was not, I would later learn, the first time my family had quietly absorbed one of Grant's financial slides. 3 years before any of this, when his first attempt at a real estate partnership collapsed, my parents had covered a debt I only found out about by accident, from a bank statement my mother asked me to help her read because the numbers looked strange. I never mentioned what I saw. I told myself it wasn't my business, which was true, and also told myself it wouldn't happen again, which was not. I understand now that both of those things can be true about a pattern at the exact same time, that it isn't your business, and that pretending not to notice it is how it keeps being nobody's business until the day it becomes everyone's. There was another pattern underneath the pattern, one I only recognized in hindsight, the kind of thing that only becomes visible once you know what shape you're looking for. Every time I asked, gently, whether we should formalize anything, whether the family should sit down with our attorney together, whether Grant should at least know where the important documents lived, in case anything ever happened to me, too. My mother would smile the specific, tired smile she used for questions she didn't want to fully answer, and say something like, "Why complicate things? We're a family, we don't need paperwork between us." I believed her, for years, because it sounded like warmth, and because arguing against it would have sounded like I was accusing my own mother of not trusting me, which was the opposite of what I meant. I understand now that "we don't need paperwork between us" is one of the more effective sentences a family can use to keep one person holding all the responsibility and none of the formal standing that responsibility should have come with. I did not need paperwork to keep showing up. It turned out I needed it, badly. The one time someone else decided to write paperwork of their own. Nobody outside that pattern had noticed. Or rather, one person had, years before any of this mattered, which was the coldest, strangest comfort I had. I hadn't been keeping a secret. I'd simply been keeping something nobody had bothered to ask about, which turns out to be a very different thing from hiding it. There was a specific afternoon, 4 months after my father's funeral, that I didn't understand the size of until much later. My mother had asked me to drive her to see Douglas Ferris, the attorney who had handled my parents' affairs since before I was born, in an office that still had my father's old files in a cabinet nobody had gotten around to boxing up. I assumed we were finalizing something related to Dad's death, a life insurance form, a property transfer, the ordinary debris that follows a person out of the world. My mother didn't explain much in the car. She just said, in the flat, careful voice she'd developed since the funeral, "I want to make sure someone sensible is in charge if anything ever happens to me too." I sat in the waiting room while she went in alone. I assumed, if I thought about it at all, that she was updating her will. I did not think about it very hard, because at the time I had 100 more urgent things to think about. A mother recently widowed, a brother who called twice a week to ask if I'd handled things yet, a job that didn't pause for any of it. When she came out 40 minutes later, she hugged me longer than usual in the parking lot and said, "Thank you for always being the one I can call." And I thought she meant it the way people mean things after a death, in general, softly, about everything. I did not know she meant something specific, on paper, with a notary's seal on it. I filed the day away the way you file most ordinary Tuesdays, meaning I mostly forgot it, the same way you forget the exact date you got a library card, because you didn't yet know it would ever matter. I want to be honest about something, because this is not a story where I was quietly plotting for 6 years. I did not think about that appointment again for a long time. I did not go looking for whatever she'd signed. I never once said to my brother, "By the way, I think Mom may have given me legal authority over her affairs," because it hadn't occurred to me to say it, the same way you don't announce you have a spare key to a house nobody's tried to break into yet. What I did instead, year after year, was keep showing up. I renewed her insurance every fall. I drove her to every follow-up after the stroke. I kept, in a shared drive I used for my actual job, a folder of every prescription, every appointment, every conversation with a doctor who mumbled. Because that is simply how I am built. The same instinct that makes me good at discharge planning for strangers, applied without any plan at all to my own mother. I was not collecting evidence. I was just being the kind of person who keeps her own records. The way some people keep receipts for a return they'll probably never make. It only became evidence later, when my brother decided the version of our family, where I did all of this quietly, for nothing, was the version he preferred to keep. The Tuesday after that dinner, I met my friend Talia Reyes for coffee before our shifts overlapped at the hospital, because she was the one person who had never once told me I was overreacting about my own family. Talia was a medical social worker, the kind who spent her days sitting with families in the worst hour of their lives and somehow still had patience left over for mine. I told her everything. The toast Grant hadn't given so much as delivered, Bianca's new phrase for me, somebody stable, landing like a job posting for a role I'd already been working for a decade. Talia didn't say what I expected. She didn't say "that's awful," or "your brother sounds exhausting," though both were true. She set down her cup and said, "Mer, I want you to actually hear what he said. He didn't say we should help Mom more. He said somebody should take charge. Those aren't the same sentence." "I know how it sounds." "I don't think you do, yet," she said. "Because you're describing it like a family disagreement. I've spent 11 years watching what it actually looks like when someone tries to take charge of a parent's affairs out of nowhere, right after a medical event, while insisting the person already handling it just wasn't doing enough. There's a name for the shape of that. I'm not going to put a label on your brother without more information, but I want you to write down, today, everything you already do for your mother. Every bill, every appointment, every text where someone asked you to handle something. Not because you're going to court. Because I think you're about to need to prove something you've never had to prove before, which is that you were already the one in charge. I told her I didn't need to prove anything. I'd been doing this for a decade. It wasn't a secret. It's not a secret, Talia said. It's just never been written down in one place. Those are different kinds of true. She reached over and turned my phone screen toward me, where a text from my mother had just landed. Grant is coming by tomorrow to help me with some house paperwork. Simple stuff, don't worry. That text, Talia said, is either exactly what it says it is, or it's the first sentence of something you're going to want a record of. I can't tell you which yet. I can tell you which one I'd bet on, if I were the betting kind, which, lucky for both of us, I'm not, professionally. Before we left that morning, Talia asked me one more question, almost as an afterthought, though I'd learn later she rarely asked anything as an afterthought. When's the last time anyone in your family asked what you needed, instead of what you could handle? I didn't have an answer ready, which was its own kind of answer. That's the actual thing worth writing down somewhere too, she said. Not for court, just for you. I laughed, because it was easier than the alternative. But I went home that night and did something I hadn't done since my father's funeral. I opened the shared drive where I kept my mother's medical records, made a new folder, and named it, half as a joke and half because some instinct older than the joke told me to, just in case. I didn't wait for tomorrow. I drove to my mother's house that same evening, the appointment with Ferris sitting so far back in my memory that I still couldn't have told you what was actually inside that folder, only that it existed, which, it turns out, is sometimes enough to walk into a room with. Grant's car was already in the driveway when I arrived, an hour earlier than the text had promised. Bianca's car was behind it. Through the front window, I could see my mother at the kitchen table, a stack of papers in front of her, a pen in her hand, and a woman I didn't recognize sitting across from her with a small embossing stamp and a stack of forms. I didn't knock. I let myself in the way I'd let myself into that house for 30 years. Meredith, Bianca stood up fast enough that her chair scraped. This is a private family matter. I am the family, I said, and looked at the woman with the stamp. Who are you? This is Denise, Bianca said, before Denise could answer for herself. She's a notary, a friend of mine. She's helping Mom get some things in order. My mother's hand, I noticed, had stopped moving on the page. Not frozen, just stopped, the way a hand stops when it's waiting to see whether it's allowed to keep going. Her eyes found mine, and there was something in them I hadn't seen since the week after her stroke, when she'd reach for a word and watch it not arrive. What things? I asked. Grant came in from the hallway holding a manila folder of his own, and for a second we simply looked at each other across our mother's kitchen, two people each holding paper the other didn't know about. A power of attorney, he said, and some trust paperwork, to protect the house from nursing home costs if it ever comes to that. Standard stuff, Mer. Who drew this up? A pause, very small, the kind you'd miss if you weren't the kind of person whose entire job was noticing the half-second before someone answers a question they didn't expect. Denise's associate handled the drafting, Grant said. Same effect as anything Ferris would do. Mom already has a power of attorney, I said. I said it the way you'd mention the time, not the way you'd throw a grenade, though I watched it land like one anyway. From 6 years ago, Ferris drew that one up. I'm the agent on it. The kitchen went the particular kind of quiet that isn't the absence of sound, so much as the presence of everyone recalculating at once. That's not, Bianca started. That's ancient, Grant said, recovering faster than his wife. Mom doesn't even remember signing that. She doesn't have to remember it, I said. It's still filed. I want to tell you I felt powerful in that moment, and I didn't. Not yet. Mostly I felt sick, watching my mother's eyes move between her son and her daughter like she was trying to work out which version of loyalty was going to cost her less. Mom, I said, gently, crouching down beside her chair the way I would with a patient who'd started to look overwhelmed. Did you understand everything you signed today? Grant said it was for the house, she said, and her voice had the flattened, careful quality it got when she was tired, when a word was sitting just out of reach and she was working around it instead of through it. Something about protecting it from costs. If I ever needed, The place. The care place. A nursing home, I said. Did anyone explain that signing this might mean you can't undo it easily? Did anyone explain what it does to who owns this house? Don't, Grant said, sharper now. Don't do the concerned professional voice on our mother Meredith. You're not her case manager, you're her daughter, same as I'm her son, and frankly, you've made a career out of making the rest of us feel like amateurs at loving our own family. That was, I would think, much later, the first fully honest sentence anyone said in that kitchen. Not because it was true, but because it was the actual complaint underneath everything else that had ever been said to me at that table, finally spoken out loud instead of implied. He didn't resent that I wasn't doing enough. He resented that I had never stopped. I need copies of everything she signed today, I said, instead of answering that. Today, not next week. That's not how this works, Bianca said. This is between Eleanor and her attorney. Then it should be between Eleanor and Douglas Ferris, I said, since he's the only attorney who's ever actually represented her. Not a notary I've never met, working off paperwork somebody's associate drafted, signed on an evening when she's tired enough to reach for a word and not find it. Denise, to her credit, had gone very still, the way people go still when they realize they may have wandered into something they'll want to be able to say they didn't understand at the time. On my way out, I caught a glimpse of the document still open on the kitchen table, upside down from where I stood, but not so upside down that I couldn't read the header. Cole Family Legacy Trust. I didn't say anything about it that night, but I remembered it precisely, the particular, faintly ironic phrase, legacy trust, because my father had never once, in 30 years, used the word legacy about anything except a joke he made every holiday about his terrible golf swing. Whoever had drafted that document had reached for a phrase that sounded like warmth and family history, the same instinct, I would realize much later, that made "we don't need paperwork between us" sound like closeness instead of what it actually was. I didn't get the copies that night. I got my mother's hand, briefly, squeezing mine under the table where Grant couldn't see it, which told me more than any document would have. I got Grant, in the driveway, telling me I was making this weird, and that not everything is a conspiracy, sometimes people are just trying to help. I got Bianca's voice through the closing car window. Some of us actually want Eleanor to have a life, not just a caretaker. I got in my own car, and I did not fall apart in that driveway. And I did not call Grant back to keep arguing, because arguing further would have made the story, that night, about my anger, instead of about what he'd actually done. I drove home with both hands steady on the wheel and one sentence repeating in my head, the sentence my mother's careful, tired voice had actually confirmed without meaning to. She hadn't understood what she signed. She'd understood it was about the house. She had not understood it might end with the house no longer fully being hers to give away, or mine to inherit alongside her wishes, or anyone's but whoever's name ended up on the new paper. I did not know yet exactly what that paper said. I only knew, pulling into my own driveway 40 minutes later, that I was done waiting to be told. I did not sleep much that night, and I did not spend the sleeplessness the way people expect. Pacing, crying, drafting furious texts I'd regret. I spent it making a list, the way I make lists at work when a discharge plan falls apart at 6 in the evening and someone has 30 minutes to fix it before a patient ends up somewhere unsafe. My list had 4 items. Call Ferris in the morning. Get a certified copy of the old document. Find out exactly what my mother signed today. Find out when and how tired she was when she did it. Douglas Ferris's office opened at 9. I was in the waiting room by 8:52, holding a coffee I didn't drink, sitting in a chair across from the same cabinet of my father's old files I remembered from years ago, back when I hadn't understood I'd need to remember any of it. Ferris was 71, the kind of lawyer who still used a fountain pen and still remembered which of his clients took cream in their coffee. He listened to the whole story without interrupting, the way people only listen when they've spent 40 years learning that interrupting a client mid-panic just makes the eventual facts harder to extract. When I finished, he didn't reach for a legal pad. He reached for a locked drawer. "Your mother came to me about 4 months after your father's funeral," he said, "wanting a durable power of attorney, effective immediately, not springing, naming you as her agent for both financial and healthcare decisions. She also wanted a healthcare directive, same terms." He slid a certified copy across the desk, my mother's signature, notarized, a date I hadn't thought about in years, suddenly sitting in my hands like it had been waiting for me the whole time. I remember the appointment specifically, because she cried through most of it, and because she said something I wrote down afterward, which I don't usually do. He turned the folder slightly so I could see his own handwritten note clipped inside. She said, "Meredith is the one who will actually read the forms. I need someone who reads the forms." "Has this ever been revoked?" I asked. "Amended? Replaced?" "Not through this office. Not that I've been informed of, and under the law, a durable power of attorney doesn't expire just because a family stops discussing it. It remains in effect until your mother formally revokes it in writing, while she has capacity to do so, or until she passes." He paused. "I understand from what you've told me that a new document may have been drafted elsewhere. I'd want to see it, because two competing powers of attorney is not generally how any of this is supposed to work, and any institution asked to honor a newer one is going to want to know why an older, unrevoked one wasn't addressed first." I asked him the question I'd been afraid to ask out loud. If she signed something yesterday that she didn't fully understand, if she was tired, if the language wasn't explained to her, does that matter? "It can matter enormously," Ferris said. "There's a legal concept called undue influence, and another called lack of capacity at the time of signing. Neither is automatic. Both require documentation of her state that day, of who was present, of what was actually explained to her, and by whom. I'd encourage you to write down, today, while it's fresh, exactly what you observed in that kitchen. Time, words used, her responses. Don't embellish it. Courts and caseworkers can tell the difference between an honest account and a performance, and an honest account is worth more." I spent that afternoon doing exactly that, in a document I titled, with the kind of dry, professional distance that had gotten me through 100 difficult family meetings at work that weren't my own family. Timeline. Eleanor Cole. I wrote down the dinner. I wrote down the text about simple paperwork. I wrote down Denise's embossing stamp, the 2 folders, my mother's hand stopping on the page. I wrote down the exact sentence Grant had said. "That's ancient. Mom doesn't even remember signing that." Because Talia had taught me, without meaning to, that the accusation someone makes against you in the heat of a moment is often a confession of what they assumed they could get away with. Then I did something harder. I called the credit union. My mother banked at the same credit union she'd used since before I was born, and because of the old document, I'd technically been listed as an authorized agent on her accounts for 6 years without ever once using that authority for anything beyond, occasionally, confirming a payment had cleared when she couldn't remember whether she'd sent it. I asked for a loan officer, and I was transferred to a woman named Renata Alvarez, who told me, in the careful, neutral tone of someone who has learned exactly how much to say on the phone and how much to save for in person, that there was, in fact, an appointment on the calendar for later this week regarding a home equity line of credit. I asked how much. "I'm not able to discuss account specifics with you over the phone without your mother present or a documented request," Renata said. Then, after a pause that told me she'd already clocked something worth being careful about, "I can tell you that given the file flags on this account, any transaction of that kind is going to require additional signatures beyond what's currently been submitted. I'd encourage whoever is coming in for that appointment to bring documentation of current authority." I thanked her, and I hung up, and I sat in my car in the hospital parking garage for 4 full minutes before I could make myself walk in for my shift, because I finally understood 2 things at once. My brother was not simply trying to help manage our mother's affairs. He was trying to pull equity out of a paid-off house using authority he did not in fact have, and he had no idea the bank already had a name on file that wasn't his. I want to be honest about something else, because this is not a story where I discovered every piece of this cleanly, in order, like a detective solving a case at no cost to anyone. That same week, going back through old messages to build the timeline Ferris had asked for, I found a text from my mother, sent the afternoon before that kitchen scene. At 2:14, "Grant says I need to sign something today. My head is aching. Can it wait until you're here?" I had been in the middle of a discharge crisis at work. An 81-year-old man with nowhere safe to go and a family arguing in the hallway. And I had answered, 4 hours later, distracted, "Should be fine. Call Ferris if you're not sure." I did not know, when I sent that, what something meant. I did not know my mother's head was aching because Denise and Grant were already in the driveway. I have read that exchange more times than I can count since then, and I have decided, slowly, to let myself off the hook for it, Because you cannot be your mother's entire safety net and also be a person with a full-time job and a life. And the fact that I mostly managed both for 6 years does not mean I owed a perfect, uninterrupted vigilance the 1 week it would have mattered most. But I did not enjoy learning that. I want you to know that, because this is not a story where I get to feel clean about every single hour of it. Somewhere in that same restless week, half out of habit and half out of something closer to instinct, I searched Denise's name online, the way I imagine most people eventually do with anyone who suddenly matters to their life without an invitation. Her notary business had exactly the kind of thin, recent web presence you'd expect. A bare page, a phone number, 4 reviews, all 5 stars, all posted within the same 11-day window a year and a half earlier. The specific pattern of reviews that exist because someone asked a favor rather than because a genuine customer sat down to write one. It wasn't proof of anything. I want to be honest about that. A handful of suspicious reviews did not, on their own, mean what I eventually learned it meant. But it sat in the back of my mind the way an unfamiliar noise sits in the back of your mind on a drive you've taken 1,000 times, not loud enough to stop the car for, just loud enough that you remember, later, exactly when you first heard it. What I did next was the part I felt cleanest about. I built a folder, not a metaphor this time, an actual folder, digital and paper both. And I put in it everything Talia and Ferris had each, separately, told me to gather. The certified original document, my own timeline, years of texts where Grant had asked me to handle something for our mother, the insurance renewal, the pharmacy switch, the funeral, the follow-up appointments, because a person who calls you unqualified to manage their mother's care has usually spent years asking you to manage exactly that. I found the mileage log I'd kept for my own tax purposes because hospital case managers learn early to document their own driving, and it turned out to be, without my ever intending it, a record of exactly who had shown up, year after year. If you've ever had to become the record keeper of your own family, the one who quietly kept the folder nobody else thought to start, tell me in the comments what the one document was that you wish, now, you'd kept a little more carefully. I ask because that question sat with me the whole week I spent gathering mine, wondering whether a habit I'd never once called a strategy was about to become the only thing standing between my mother and a house that wasn't fully hers to give away anymore. 2 days before the credit union appointment, I drove to my mother's house on a morning I knew Grant had a showing across town, and I found her in the garden, deadheading the roses my father had planted the year before he died, moving slower than she used to, but steady enough that some old fear in my chest loosened slightly at the sight of her. I didn't bring the folder. I didn't bring Ferris's name or Renata's warning, or any of the language I'd practiced in the car. I just sat down on the step beside her and asked the only question that actually mattered. Mom, do you want Grant handling your money and your house? Not what you think you're supposed to say, what you actually want. She was quiet long enough that I thought, for a terrible second, the answer was going to be yes, and that everything I'd built that week was about to become an argument against my own mother's wishes instead of for them. Then she set down the shears. I want, she said, slowly, working around a word the way she still sometimes had to, not to be a problem. That's what I want. I don't want to be the reason you two fight. Grant said if I didn't sign, it would look like I trusted you more, and I didn't want him to feel that. I didn't understand most of what was on those pages, Meredith. I understood the pen. I understood Denise was nice about it. I didn't understand the rest, and I was tired, and I signed it because everyone in my kitchen was waiting, and it felt easier than asking them to explain it again. That's allowed to matter, I said. You not fully understanding something you signed. That's allowed to matter, Mom. It's not a small thing. I know you have the old paper, she said, which surprised me, because I hadn't told her I'd gone to Ferris. Douglas called me. He wanted to make sure I was all right. I told him I was fine. I don't know if that was true. She looked at me, and for a moment the flattened, careful voice fell away entirely, and I saw the woman who used to grade 140 essays a week and still remembered every student's name for years afterward. I never took that old paper away from you, Meredith. Whatever else happens, I want you to know I never meant to. I did not tell her, that morning, everything I now knew about the credit union appointment, or the amount Renata wouldn't confirm over the phone, because I did not want her to spend 2 days afraid before a fight that hadn't happened yet. I told her only that I loved her, that nobody was going to make her sign anything else without understanding every word of it first, and that whatever happened at the bank, she would not be handling it alone. I drove home that afternoon with something in my chest that wasn't quite relief, and wasn't quite grief, but sat somewhere close to both, and I understood, more clearly than Ferris's certified copy or Renata's careful warning had made me understand, exactly what I was protecting, and why it had never really been about a house at all. The credit union's conference room had beige walls and a bowl of peppermints nobody touched, and I want to tell you I walked in feeling powerful, and I didn't. Not yet. I walked in feeling like a woman standing on a floor she wasn't entirely sure would hold. My mother had asked me to come. That mattered more to me than anything else that happened that morning. Not that I'd forced my way in, not that I'd shown up uninvited the way I had at her kitchen table, but that 2 days after our conversation in the garden, she had called Grant herself and said, in a voice steadier than I'd heard from her in months, "Meredith is coming with me on Thursday. I want her there." He hadn't argued. I don't think, even then, he understood what that sentence meant. Grant arrived first, in the navy suit he wore for closings, carrying a leather folio and the specific, buoyant confidence of a man who has never once had a plan fail in a room with his name on the paperwork. Bianca came with him, sitting slightly behind, phone already out, the way she sat at every family gathering where she wanted plausible distance from whatever was about to happen. My mother came in on my arm, and Renata Alvarez came in last, with a laptop and a manila folder of her own, and closed the door. "Thanks so much for accommodating us," Grant said, sliding into the chair across from Renata, like this was a closing he'd run 100 times. Which, in a sense, it was. "We're looking to open a home equity line against my mother's property. I've got the POA here." He tapped his folio. "Everything should be in order." "I appreciate that," Renata said. "Before we go further, I want to walk through something that came up when I pulled the file." She turned her laptop slightly, not enough to show us the screen, enough to show she wasn't hiding anything either. "This account has had a documented agent on file for 6 years, Meredith Cole, under a durable power of attorney drawn up by a Douglas Ferris. That authorization has never been revoked in our system. When a new POA is presented for a transaction like this one, our compliance process requires us to reconcile it against any existing authorization already on file. I wasn't able to find a revocation, so before I can move forward with any transaction on this account, I need either Meredith's consent as the existing agent, or documentation that the earlier POA has been formally revoked by Mrs. Cole while competent to do so." I watched my brother's face do something I will remember for a long time. Not anger first, but confusion, the specific confusion of a man recalculating a plan in real time and not yet finding the error. "That POA is ancient," he said. "It's not. Nobody's used that in years." "Not being used and not being valid aren't the same thing," Renata said in the flattest, most professional voice I have ever been grateful for. "I have to work from what's actually on file." "This is absurd," Bianca said, leaning forward. "Meredith doesn't even live with Eleanor. She sees her once a week. Grant has been the one actually managing things day to day." "I haven't been asked to evaluate who's been managing what day to day," Renata said. "I'm evaluating whose signature this institution is authorized to rely on for a transaction of this size. Right now, that's Meredith Cole, per the existing document, unless something changes that." "How much were you asking to borrow?" I asked. It was the first thing I'd said since we sat down, and I asked it quietly, the way I ask a family in a hospital consultation room, the one question they've been avoiding. Grant didn't answer right away. Renata, after a glance at my mother that was really a question, "Do you want me to say this in front of her?" and my mother's small, steady nod said, "The application on file requests $110,000. My mother made a sound I hadn't heard her make since my father's funeral, small and involuntary, the sound of a number landing somewhere she hadn't expected it to land. "That's for the house," Grant said quickly. "Repairs. The roof. You've seen the roof. You know it needs work." "The roof estimate Mom got in the spring was $4,000, I said. "I was there for that quote. What's the other 106 for, Grant?" He didn't answer that either. Bianca answered for him, which told me almost as much as an answer would have. "You don't get to interrogate him like this is a deposition." "I'm not interrogating anyone," I said. "I'm asking my brother a question in front of the woman whose house he's trying to borrow 6 figures against, using authority he doesn't actually have. That seems like a fair question to be able to answer. You didn't need my blessing, Grant, I said, and this was the sentence I would think about for a long time afterward, the one that surprised me by how calm it came out. You needed my signature. Those aren't the same thing. I don't think either of us fully understood, until about 90 seconds ago, how much that was going to matter. Renata, to her enormous credit, let the silence sit exactly as long as it needed to. Then she closed her laptop partway, a small, deliberate gesture that somehow ended the meeting more effectively than words would have. I'm not able to proceed with this application today, she said. I'd recommend the family resolve the question of authorization, through counsel, through the courts if necessary, before bringing another application back to us. I'll also need to flag, for our own compliance file, that a second power of attorney was presented today that appears to conflict with an existing one on record. That's not an accusation. It's a requirement on our end. Flag it with who? Grant asked, and for the first time his voice had lost its polish entirely. Internally, for now, Renata said. Though I'll say, and I'd be saying this to any family in this position, not specifically to yours, when an existing power of attorney predates a new one, and the new one was used to attempt a transaction like this, some institutions are required to make a report to Adult Protective Services as a matter of policy, particularly given Mrs. Cole's recent medical history. I don't make that call today, but I want you to understand it's a possibility, so nobody in this room is surprised by it later. I watched my brother's face when he heard the words Adult Protective Services out loud, in an official room, from someone whose job had nothing to do with our family, and everything to do with rules that didn't bend for good haircuts. It was the first time all week his confidence actually left his face instead of just flickering. This is insane, he said. I'm trying to help my own mother, and you're going to make it sound like elder abuse. I'm not making it sound like anything, Renata said. I'm telling you what the document reconciliation on this account requires. What it sounds like isn't something I control. My mother spoke then, for the first time since we'd sat down, in a voice that had none of the fatigue-softened caution I'd heard in the garden 2 days earlier. I didn't understand what I signed with Denise, she said. I want that on whatever record you're keeping. I didn't understand it, and nobody explained it to me the way you just did in about 4 sentences. Mom, Grant started. I'm not finished, she said, and I don't think I had heard my mother say that sentence to her son in my entire life. I raised both of you to take care of each other, and to take care of me when it came to that. I did not raise either of you to need a stranger at a credit union to explain to me what I'd agreed to. I'm ashamed of that, and none of the shame is Meredith's. We left 20 minutes later with nothing signed, nothing borrowed, and a compliance flag sitting in a file none of us controlled anymore. Grant didn't speak to me in the parking lot. Bianca did, exactly once, through a rolled-down window, in a voice pitched for anyone nearby to hear. You just humiliated your own brother in front of a stranger, Meredith. I hope that felt good. He humiliated himself the day he decided he didn't need to ask, I said. I just happened to be in the room when the bank noticed. I drove my mother home in a silence that felt, for the first time in 5 months, less like exhaustion and more like relief, slowly arriving somewhere it had been trying to reach for a long time. That evening, my phone rang 11 times before I turned the ringer off. Grant left one voicemail I actually listened to, at 9:40 that night, his voice stripped of the closing day polish for the first time in longer than I could remember. You could have called me before you went to Ferris, he said. You could have handled this like a sister instead of like, whatever that was today. I don't even know what you want from me, Mer. Do you want an apology? Do you want the deed? What's the actual goal here? I didn't call him back that night. I sat with the voicemail for a long time, though, because underneath the anger, there was a real question in it. One I thought deserved a real answer eventually, just not one delivered at 9:40 p.m. to a voicemail inbox. The goal had never been the deed, or an apology, or even, if I'm honest, watching his face do what it did in that conference room, though I won't pretend that moment didn't sit in my chest like something warm, for longer than I probably should admit. The goal, if I'd had to say it out loud that night, was smaller and larger at the same time. I wanted my mother to finish signing anything, ever again, only after she understood every word of it. That was the whole thing. Everything else was just what it took to get there. He showed up at my hospital 3 days after the credit union meeting, which I only learned because the front desk called up to my unit to say a man matching my brother's description was in the lobby, getting a little insistent, and could I please come down. I found him standing by the vending machines, in a blazer that had clearly been chosen for the occasion. The specific blazer he wore when he wanted to look like someone whose word could be trusted on sight. "You can't keep avoiding me," he said, before I'd even reached him. "I'm not avoiding you, I'm at work." I glanced at the nurse behind the desk, who was doing the specific kind of not listening that meant she was listening very carefully. "Grant, this isn't the place." "Then tell me where the place is, because you won't answer my calls, and Mom won't tell me anything except that she's letting the process happen," which sounds like something you taught her to say. He was talking fast, the way he talked when a deal was slipping, and he could feel it slipping. "I need you to understand that if this turns into some kind of investigation, it doesn't just hurt me, Mur. It hurts Mom. Do you want strangers going through her finances? Do you want her having to explain herself to some caseworker like she did something wrong?" "She already did explain herself to a caseworker," I said. "It went fine. Better than fine. She told the truth, and the truth didn't hurt her, Grant. It's not going to. The only thing that's going to get hurt by someone looking closely at what happened in that kitchen is whatever story you were hoping nobody would look at closely." He was quiet for a second, and something in his face shifted, the particular shift of a man realizing the person across from him is not going to be talked back into an easier version of events. "I'm not the villain here," he said, quieter now. "I know you don't think you are," I said. "I actually believe that. I don't think you woke up one morning and decided to take something from Mom. I think you got scared about money, and you found a version of events where fixing that felt like helping her instead of using her, and you believed that version because believing it was easier than the alternative. I understand how that happens, Grant. I even feel for you a little, if you want to know the truth. None of that changes what the actual documents say, or what happens next." He left without saying goodbye, which was, I would realize later, the last real conversation the two of us would have before the hearing. I went back upstairs, finished my shift, and did not tell anyone at work what had just happened in the lobby, because I had learned, by then, exactly how much of this I needed to carry quietly, and exactly how much I needed to finally put down. I thought about that conversation more than almost any other, in the weeks after, because it was the only moment in the entire 5 months where my brother said something close to the truth without being forced into a room by an institution first. It made me wonder, uselessly, what might have happened if he'd said it 3 weeks earlier, at our mother's kitchen table, instead of by a vending machine after he'd already tried to move $110,000 against her house. I don't know that it would have changed anything. I know that I would have liked, at least once, to find out. I did not wait for my brother to make the next move, because I had learned, by then, that waiting for Grant to make the next move was how the entire situation had gotten this far in the first place. 2 days after the credit union, I sat at my kitchen table on a Saturday morning and wrote the most careful letter of my life, and I made sure, the way Ferris had taught me without quite meaning to, that it did not contain a single feeling. I addressed it to Grant, to Bianca, to my mother, and to Denise the notary, with a copy to Douglas Ferris. I stated, in plain, flat sentences, that Eleanor Cole's durable power of attorney, naming Meredith Cole as agent, remained in full effect and had never been revoked. I stated that any power of attorney or trust document executed subsequently, without addressing that existing authorization, was of disputed validity and should not be relied upon by any institution, notary, or family member going forward. I stated that I was requesting, formally and in writing, a full accounting of any transactions attempted or completed on Eleanor Cole's accounts or property since the date of her stroke. I stated that all further communication regarding my mother's financial or legal affairs should be in writing, copied to Douglas Ferris. I attached the certified original document, Renata's written confirmation of the account's existing agent designation, and my own timeline, dated and factual. It read like something out of an insurance manual. It felt, writing it, like the coldest thing I had ever produced, and also like the first completely solid ground I'd stood on in 5 months. I sent it certified mail, and by email, and I blind copied myself, and I saved every piece of it into a folder I titled, with no more creativity than the moment called for, Cole, Financial Record. Then I did something Talia had been gently suggesting for 2 weeks, and I finally understood why she'd kept suggesting it instead of simply telling me to do it. I called Adult Protective Services myself, not because Renata had threatened to, because I had decided, sitting with my mother's voice in that conference room, I didn't understand it, and nobody explained it to me, that my mother deserved a record that existed independent of whether my brother's next lawyer decided to make an issue out of it. I gave the caseworker who took my call every date, every document, every account of the kitchen scene and the credit union meeting, in the same flat, factual register I'd used in the letter. I did not ask her to punish anyone. I asked her to open a file. "You understand," the caseworker said, gently, near the end of the call, "that once we open this, it isn't only in your control anymore. There will be an interview with your mother, alone, without you or your brother present. There may be a review of the financial records. This can take weeks." "I understand," I said. "I'd rather it take weeks and be right than take a day and be wrong." A cease and desist letter has no tone of voice. That was exactly the point. It cannot be interrupted, cannot be talked over at a dinner table, cannot be reframed by whoever gets to speak first. 2 days after it went out, the family group chat, a thread called Cole Family that had mostly, for years, been used for birthday reminders and the occasional argument about holiday seating, erupted with a message from Bianca, time-stamped 11:47 p.m., the specific hour reserved for messages people regret by morning and send anyway. "Some people," she wrote, "would rather tear a family apart than admit their brother might actually love their mother. I hope everyone here sees what's actually happening. Meredith is punishing Grant for having a life she doesn't have, and she's using Eleanor's confusion to do it." What followed was 17 minutes of relatives I mostly saw at holidays, weighing in with the specific confidence of people who had witnessed none of it. An aunt I hadn't spoken to in 8 months wrote, "Family takes care of family. It's a shame it's come to lawyers." A cousin wrote, "Grant's always been the one who actually shows up. This feels like jealousy talking." Someone's husband, who I don't think had met my mother more than twice, wrote, "Sounds like somebody needs control more than she needs to admit it." I let 17 minutes of that sit unanswered. Not because I didn't have an answer, but because Talia had taught me, without either of us naming it directly, that the first response to a pile-on is rarely the one you want on the record forever. Then I wrote exactly one message, and I did not write it in anger, though I want to be honest that anger was available to me in nearly unlimited supply that night. For clarity, I hold a valid, notarized power of attorney for my mother, executed 6 years ago, which has never been revoked. I have never used it to take anything from anyone. I used it, this week, to stop a $110,000 loan from being taken out against her house using a document she has stated, on the record, that she did not fully understand when she signed it. I'm not interested in punishing Grant. I'm interested in my mother finishing every sentence she signs having actually understood it first. If that reads as controlling to anyone in this chat, I'd invite you to sit with why protecting someone and controlling them have started to sound the same to this family. Then I attached one photograph. The signature page of the certified document, my mother's handwriting, Ferris's raised notary seal catching the light. Just the one. I had learned by then that a single undeniable page does more work than 100 angry paragraphs, and that anything more than one photograph starts to look like an argument instead of a fact. For 9 minutes, nobody typed. I know it was 9 minutes, because I watched the little indicator that shows someone composing a message appear and disappear 4 separate times before anyone actually sent anything. Then my aunt, the one who'd mentioned lawyers, wrote, simply, "I didn't know that. I'm sorry," and left the chat entirely 15 minutes later. The cousin who'd called it jealousy never responded again in that thread, though she texted me privately 3 days after. An apology that started with, "I feel terrible," and ended with a question about whether her own mother's paperwork was up to date, which told me almost everything I needed to know about how many families in that chat were quietly wondering the same thing about themselves. Grant texted me the next morning, not in the group chat, just to me, at 6:52 a.m. "You didn't have to humiliate me in front of the whole family to prove a point. I would have backed off if you'd just talked to me like a person instead of a caseworker. I know you think I was trying to steal from Mom. I wasn't. My business is in trouble, Mer. I was trying to fix it before anyone had to know how bad it's gotten, and I told myself the house money made sense because I was going to pay it back before anyone noticed, and I know how that sounds now, and I still don't think that makes me the villain you've decided I am." I read it twice. It was, in its way, the first true thing my brother had said to me in 5 months, and it did not change one single fact in the letter I had already sent, the file I had already opened, or the accounting the credit union's compliance file, was already generating without either of our permission anymore. I did not answer him with comfort, and I did not answer him with cruelty either. I wrote back 4 sentences. I believe you that you didn't set out to hurt Mom. I believe the business trouble is real, and I'm sorry it's as bad as that text makes it sound. None of that changes what I'm going to keep doing, which is making sure she never signs anything again without fully understanding it first. If you want help with the business trouble itself, from an actual accountant, I will help you find one, but not with her signature, and not with her house. He didn't respond to that. I didn't expect him to. Not right away. I understood, reading my own message back, that I had just done the thing Talia told me, weeks earlier, that I would eventually have to do: separate my brother's real, human desperation from the specific thing he'd done with it, and hold both of those at once, without letting one erase the other. I have not told you very much about the rest of my life during these months, because for most of them, there wasn't much of the rest of my life left to tell. I had been seeing someone, a physical therapist named Marcus, for a little over 2 years, long enough that we'd started, quietly, making the kind of plans people make when they've stopped being careful about saying things out loud. That season, most of those plans sat untouched on a shelf neither of us mentioned, because I came home most nights too depleted to do anything except reread the same text message for warning signs I might have missed the first time. Marcus did not complain, not for a long time, which I understand now was its own kind of quiet labor I wasn't paying enough attention to. He learned, without being told, to stop asking "How was your day?" on the nights I came home from my mother's house, and to ask instead, "Do you want to talk, or do you want a distraction?" Which is a kinder question than it sounds like, and one I wish I'd thought to ask other people more often in my own life. It was Marcus, the night after Grant's visit to my hospital, who finally said the thing I'd been waiting for someone to say, though I hadn't especially wanted to hear it from him. "I need you to know I'm not going anywhere," he said. "But I also need to say this once, and then I'll drop it. You're allowed to want your own life back at some point. Protecting your mom doesn't have to mean disappearing into it completely. I've watched you do that for 2 months now, and I don't think anyone in all of this has once asked who's taking care of the person taking care of everyone." I didn't have a clean answer for him that night, and I don't think he expected one. What I did, instead, over the following weeks, was smaller than a resolution. I started, deliberately, leaving my phone in another room for 1 hour every evening, a boundary that felt almost embarrassingly small compared to everything else I was managing, and that turned out to matter more than I expected. It did not fix anything by itself. It just reminded me, most evenings, that I was still allowed to be a person with a life outside of everyone else's paperwork, which was apparently a fact I had needed a physical therapist to say out loud before I let myself believe it. The Adult Protective Services investigation moved slower than television makes these things look, which I understood, professionally, better than most people would have. I had spent a decade watching institutions move at the speed institutions actually move, not the speed a family in crisis wants them to. Caseworker Priscilla Ortiz called me back 4 days after my initial report to schedule an interview with my mother, alone, at my mother's house, on a weekday morning when neither Grant nor I would be present. "I know that's hard to hear," Ortiz told me on the phone. "You've done the right things so far, and I need you to trust that the interview needs to happen without you in the room, or it isn't worth anything to anyone, including your mother." I trusted it, though trusting it and finding it easy were 2 different things. I spent that Tuesday morning at work, distracted through an entire discharge meeting, checking my phone under the conference table like a teenager, until my mother called at 11:20 to tell me, in a voice that sounded steadier than it had in months. She was kind, Meredith. She asked me questions nobody's bothered asking me since the stroke. She asked if I felt afraid of anyone in my own house. I told her no. She asked if I felt pressured. I told her the truth. The investigation, once it actually opened its file, moved faster than any of us expected, for a reason none of us had anticipated. Denise, the notary Bianca had brought into that kitchen, was not, it turned out, a stranger to this particular process. Ortiz's office found 2 prior complaints on file involving Denise's notarizations for elderly clients in the county. Neither had resulted in charges, both had been closed for lack of follow-through from families too exhausted or too embarrassed to pursue them further, but both existed, dated, on record, sitting exactly where nobody had thought to look until my case gave someone a reason to cross-reference her name. My family's situation was not, it turned out, an isolated bad decision by one desperate son. It was the third time in 4 years this specific notary had shown up beside a vulnerable, recently widowed or recently ill client, holding paperwork someone else had drafted. Ferris, working alongside Ortiz's office once the investigation formally opened, filed a petition asking the county court to formally void the second power of attorney and the accompanying trust document on the grounds of lack of informed consent and a conflicting, valid, unrevoked prior authorization. The hearing was scheduled 6 weeks after the credit union meeting, in a courtroom smaller and plainer than I'd expected, with a judge who looked, if anything, faintly bored by how straightforward the paperwork in front of her actually was once it was laid out in order. Grant's attorney, a sharp, expensive-looking man named Corbin Doyle, opened by suggesting, in the reasonable, unhurried tone attorneys use when they know their case is thin, that this was fundamentally a family misunderstanding that had unfortunately escalated through some unnecessary institutional involvement. The judge did not look up from the file in front of her. "Counsel," she said, "I have 2 powers of attorney in front of me, executed years apart, by the same principle, neither one revoking the other in writing, and one of them was used to attempt a $110,000 transaction 6 weeks ago. Walk me through why that's a misunderstanding, rather than exactly what it looks like." Doyle tried a different angle. My client believed, in good faith, that his mother's wishes had evolved. Did he ask her attorney of record before drafting a competing document? He used a different notary service. That wasn't my question. Ortiz testified next, plainly, from her notes, about the interview with my mother, the questions asked, the answers given, my mother's own statement, given without me or Grant present, that she had not understood what the new documents did to ownership of the house, that she had signed because everyone was waiting, and she was tired and it felt easier than asking again. Ferris testified about the original appointment, my mother's own words to him that day, Meredith is the one who will actually read the forms, entered into the record from his contemporaneous notes. Renata Alvarez submitted a written statement since the credit union preferred not to send an employee to testify in person, confirming the account's authorization history and the flagged transaction. Bianca testified too, called by Grant's own attorney, I think, in the hope that she could speak to the family's good intentions in a way that might soften the paperwork sitting in front of the judge. It did not go the way Doyle had planned. Asked directly whether she had contacted Denise, the notary, Bianca said yes, that Denise was a family friend who had always been generous with her time. Asked how she knew Denise, specifically, Bianca said they'd met through mutual friends a few years back. Asked whether she was aware Denise had prior complaints filed against her notary practice, Bianca said no, visibly, genuinely surprised, in a way that told me she likely hadn't looked any further into Denise than convenience required. Asked whether anyone had read the trust document aloud to my mother, in full, before she signed it. Bianca was quiet for a moment before saying, "I don't believe so, no. We were on a bit of a timeline that day." The judge did not comment on that answer. She didn't need to. I watched 2 members of the gallery, cousins who had, weeks earlier, called me the jealous one in a group chat, exchange a look I recognized, because I'd worn some version of it myself, more than once, over the past several months. It was the look of people quietly updating a story they'd been telling themselves. I did not enjoy watching her answer those questions, which surprised me a little. I had spent weeks being angry at Bianca specifically, in a way I hadn't quite let myself be angry at Grant, because Grant's fear at least made a kind of sense to me, and Bianca's willingness to bring a favor-owing notary into my mother's kitchen felt, at the time, like something colder. Watching her sit in that chair, though, visibly realizing in real time how thin her own knowledge of the situation actually was, I felt less like I was watching a villain get caught, and more like I was watching someone discover how much of her own certainty had been borrowed from someone else's confidence. I don't know if that makes what she did more forgivable. I know it made it more understandable, and by then I had learned that those 2 things don't have to arrive together to both be worth noticing. The financial accounting Ferris and Ortiz's office had compiled in the meantime painted a fuller picture of my brother's business than any of us had ever seen at a family dinner, where the answer to "how's work" had always been some version of "busy, good, can't complain." The house flip that had gone bad the year before wasn't a single unlucky project, it turned out, but the third in a run of increasingly leveraged bets. each one financed partly against the profits of the last, in the specific, exhausting way that looks like momentum right up until the moment it doesn't. Then it was my mother's turn, and I want to tell you this was the part I had dreaded most, more than anything Grant's attorney might say about me, because I did not want my mother made to perform her own vulnerability in a room full of strangers for anyone's satisfaction, including the court's. She did not perform anything. She sat very straight, and she spoke slowly, working around words the way she still sometimes had to, and she said, "I don't remember every sentence in the papers Denise brought to my kitchen. I remember that I was tired, and that everyone was waiting, and that I signed because it felt like the fastest way to make the waiting stop. I do remember, very clearly, the appointment with Douglas Ferris 6 years ago, after my husband died, because I chose to make that appointment myself, when I was not tired, and no one was waiting on me, and I named my daughter, because she is the one who has read every form I have ever been handed since. I would like that to remain true." The judge's ruling, delivered from the bench that same afternoon, rather than held for a later date, was shorter than I expected any legal document to be. The original durable power of attorney, executed with full documented capacity, and never formally revoked, remained the sole valid authorization on Eleanor Cole's financial and healthcare affairs. The second power of attorney and the accompanying trust document, executed under circumstances the court found insufficient to establish informed, unpressured consent, were void from the date of signing. Any transaction attempted under the voided document, there had, it turned out, been one smaller transfer that had briefly cleared before the credit union's own compliance flag caught the larger one, roughly $6,000 written from a checking account to a business associated with Grant, discovered only once the accounting Ortiz's office requested came back, was ordered returned, with a full reckoning due to the court within 30 days. The matter of possible criminal referral for financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, the judge noted, would be forwarded to the county prosecutor's office for independent review, separate from this civil finding, and was not resolved by today's ruling. The judge did turn to my brother once, briefly, near the end, in a tone that had none of the sharpness she'd used with his attorney and none of the warmth she'd use a moment later with my mother, simply level, the tone of someone who had seen this particular family shape many times before and had run out of patience for pretending she hadn't. "Mr. Cole," she said, "I don't doubt that your financial circumstances are difficult, and I don't doubt that some part of you has convinced yourself this was a rescue rather than a risk. I'd ask you to consider, going forward, that your mother's trust in your sister was never a referendum on how much she loved you. It was a decision about who reads the fine print. Those are different questions, and I'd encourage your family to stop treating them as the same one." Grant didn't respond. I watched him instead do something I hadn't seen him do in longer than I could remember. He looked down at his own hands. For almost a full 10 seconds, the way you look at your hands when you're checking whether they still belong to the version of yourself you'd been describing to everyone else. She closed the file, looked, briefly, less bored and more simply tired in the specific way people get tired of watching the same shape of story arrive in different families. "Mrs. Cole," she said, to my mother directly, in a voice that had softened by exactly the amount the moment required, and not 1 degree more, "I want to say for the record that choosing someone 6 years ago, because you trusted her to read the fine print, is not a small or a shameful decision. It is, in my courtroom's experience, one of the wiser things a person can do for themselves. I hope your family finds its way to seeing it that way too, eventually. If you think a piece of paper can't be an act of love, I want you to sit with that sentence the way I did, driving my mother home from that courthouse in a silence that finally, after 5 months, felt like something closer to peace than exhaustion. But first, tell me, has anyone in your own family ever mistaken your patience for permission, the way mine mistook my quiet for an absence of anything worth defending?" The consequences did not arrive all at once. They came in waves, the way water finds every low place in a foundation eventually, and each wave took something further from the version of my family that had spent 5 months running on charm instead of honesty. First, the professional wave. Word travels strangely in a town the size of ours, especially in an industry like real estate, where half of Grant's business had always depended on people believing he was the reasonable, trustworthy option in a field full of overpromising strangers. I don't know exactly how the story crossed from a courthouse filing to actual conversation, though I have my suspicions about a clerk who golfs with one of Grant's former clients. What I do know is that within 6 weeks, two of his listings quietly moved to other agents, and a broker who had been courting him for a partnership position stopped returning his calls. He complained to our mother that people were believing a version of events that isn't even accurate, and I understand, better than I probably let on to him, how frightening it is to watch your professional reputation shift based on a story you can't fully control the shape of. I also understand that the story didn't need me to spread it. It only needed to be true. Second, the reputational wave inside the family itself. The aunt who'd left the group chat sent me, 3 weeks later, a long email that started with an apology and ended, unexpectedly, with her own story. An account of how her late mother-in-law had signed something similar, years earlier, at a moment of grief nobody had thought to protect her from, and how the family had simply absorbed the loss rather than question it, because questioning it had felt, at the time, like betraying somebody's memory of being helpful. Are we the kind of family that only notices this after someone else does the noticing for us? She asked, and I didn't have a comfortable answer for her, because I suspected the answer was yes, and had been yes for longer than any of us wanted to admit. Two cousins reached out separately to ask, almost sheepishly, whether I thought their own parents' paperwork was in order, which was its own kind of answer to a question none of us had asked directly. How many families in that group chat had a version of this story sitting quietly, unexamined, in somebody's future? Third, the personal wave, the one that landed hardest on Grant specifically. The county prosecutor's office, after an independent review that took the better part of 4 months, declined to pursue criminal charges, citing insufficient evidence that Grant had known, at the time of signing, that the transaction would be improper. A decision I understood, professionally, even as it landed strangely in my chest, somewhere between relief and something that wasn't quite disappointment. I sat with that outcome longer than I expected to, turning it over during the drive home from the meeting where Ferris told me the news. Some part of me, a part I'm not entirely proud of, had wanted the harder answer, had wanted the story to resolve the way stories are supposed to resolve, with a clean villain and a clean ending, and no leftover, complicated tenderness for the person who'd tried to take something from the person I loved most. What I got instead was messier and, I think now, more honest. A brother who had done something serious enough to lose his authority, his reputation, and years of his mother's easy trust, but not something the law was willing to call criminal, because intent is a harder thing to prove than harm. And because, I suspect, though nobody said this in the meeting, a system built to catch calculating predators sometimes has less room in it for a scared, arrogant man who talked himself into believing his own convenient story. I do not think that makes the system wrong. I think it means the story I'd been telling myself, in which there was a single correct amount of consequence waiting at the end of all this, was never going to survive contact with how these things actually resolve. I let that go, eventually, the way you let go of a lot of things you didn't get to choose the ending of. The civil finding stood regardless. The $6,000 was repaid, in installments, the first 2 of which arrived exactly on time, and the third of which arrived 4 days late with no explanation, which felt, somehow, entirely consistent with the whole shape of who my brother had always been, capable of doing the right thing, reliably capable of doing it slightly late, slightly grudgingly, in a way that made you grateful for the outcome, and tired of the process at the same time. He had to give up managing our mother's affairs entirely, formally, in writing, filed with the same court that had voided his POA, not as a punishment exactly, though I know he experienced it that way, but as the plain mechanical consequence of a document that had never actually been his to hold in the first place. He told our mother, during one of the 2 visits he made that fall, that the bureaucracy around all this has gotten completely out of hand, and she told me about it afterward, in the flattened voice she still sometimes used when she was choosing not to feel something fully in the moment, and I understood that bureaucracy was simply the word my brother had chosen for a set of rules he had never before had to actually follow. The first holiday after the ruling was smaller than any I remembered, and quieter in a way that had nothing to do with sadness. My mother hosted anyway, because she said she wasn't going to let one difficult year cancel 30 good ones, and I believed her more than I expected to. Grant came, with Bianca, and for the first hour nobody mentioned any of it. The way families manage a kind of collective agreement to let a wound sit unremarked upon at the table, even when everyone there knows exactly where it is. It was my aunt, the one who had left the group chat, then written the long apologetic email, who finally said something out loud, over pie, in the specific tone people use when they've decided a thing needs saying, before it calcifies into something nobody's allowed to mention. I want to say, in front of everyone, she said, that I was wrong back in the spring, and that I'm glad Meredith did what she did, even though it was uncomfortable for all of us to watch. Nobody responded right away. Grant looked at his plate. My mother reached over and squeezed my hand under the table, the same gesture I'd once given her, quietly returned. Bianca said, after a pause just long enough to notice, "I think we all learned something," which was not an apology, but also wasn't nothing, and I let it be exactly the size it was, the way I was learning to do with most of what my family offered me now. Later that evening, washing dishes with my mother, while everyone else sat in the other room, she said, without looking up from the sink, "You know, I used to think keeping the peace meant not making anyone uncomfortable. I'm starting to think it just meant making sure the discomfort always landed on you instead of being shared properly." I didn't have a response ready, so I just kept drying the plate in my hands, and we stood there for a while in a silence that had, for the first time in longer than I could remember, nothing unfinished sitting inside it. There was a fourth consequence I almost didn't count, because it happened quietly, off to the side of everything else, and because I want to be careful not to take too much credit for consequences that were never mine to cause. Denise's notary commission came up for review with the county 3 months after the hearing, once Ortiz's office forwarded its findings alongside the 2 older, previously closed complaints. I don't know the full outcome of that review. It isn't the kind of thing that gets announced to the family whose case triggered it, but I know, because Ferris mentioned it in passing, that her commission was not renewed that cycle, and that the 2 families from the older complaints were, for the first time in years, contacted directly and told their concerns were finally being formally reconsidered. I hadn't set out to fix anyone else's family. I had only set out to protect mine. It turned out those 2 things had never been as separate as I'd assumed. Bianca's wave arrived last, and smallest, and somehow the one that told me the most about how the whole 5 months had actually looked from outside our family. She had, at some point during the credit union fallout, posted a vague, carefully worded story to her social media about family members who choose control over love, without naming anyone, the kind of post designed to be read as brave by people who didn't have the context and read as unmistakable by everyone who did. It got, by her own account to a mutual acquaintance who later told me about it, considerably less sympathy than she'd expected. Several of her own friends, it turned out, had stories of their own about a controlling in-law or a signed-away house, and the comments underneath her careful vagueness filled up with people quietly, cautiously asking questions that weren't the questions she'd wanted anyone to ask. She deleted it within a week. She never mentioned it to me directly, and I never brought it up, because by then I had learned the specific relief of not needing the last word on every single thing that happened to land in my favor. I told Talia all of it, eventually, over the same coffee shop table where this had started, and she listened the way she always did, without rushing to a lesson. When I finished, she said, "You know what the actual rare thing was in this story? It wasn't the paperwork. Plenty of people have paperwork sitting somewhere they've forgotten about. The rare thing was that you were already, quietly, the kind of person worth appointing, years before anyone needed to find that out under pressure. The document didn't make you trustworthy, Mer. It just finally got asked to prove what everyone who actually paid attention already knew. I didn't have an answer for that beyond thank you, which felt, for once, like exactly enough. What surprised me most, in that stretch of waves, was my mother. Freed, slowly, from the exhausting work of managing everyone else's feelings about her own house, she started, for the first time since the stroke, sleeping through the night without the fragmented, anxious waking Talia had warned me was common in situations like hers. She started tending the roses again, properly, not just deadheading them but actually reading the little care instructions my father had left stuck to the inside of the shed door, as if some part of her had finally freed up enough attention to return to something she loved instead of something she was managing. She called me one Tuesday, unprompted, just to tell me she'd finished a whole crossword puzzle on her own. No help, first time since the stroke, and I sat in a hospital stairwell during a 15-minute break and cried in a way I hadn't let myself cry through any of the actual crisis, because it turned out the thing I'd been protecting, this entire time, wasn't a house or a signature at all. It was whatever was left of my mother's capacity to feel like herself, and it had been quietly, slowly coming back. 8 months after that dinner, where Grant first said the words, "somebody stable," my mother asked me to come by on a Saturday, alone. No particular occasion, just to sit on the porch the way we used to before any of this started. She'd gotten steadier by then, her words came easier most days, the fatigue less likely to swallow an afternoon whole, though Talia had warned me, gently, that recoveries like hers rarely move in a straight line, and some days still arrived harder than others. She didn't apologize. Not exactly, in the tidy, complete way people apologize in the version of this story I might have imagined for myself a year earlier. What she said, instead, sitting with her hands wrapped around a mug of tea she'd made without help, for the first time in longer than either of us tracked, was, "I think I let myself believe, for a long time, that being loved by both of you meant I didn't have to choose which one of you actually understood my life. I know now that isn't true. I know now that choosing you, 6 years ago, wasn't a small thing, even though I let myself treat it like paperwork, instead of the biggest vote of confidence I think I've ever cast in anyone. It was the fullest sentence I'd heard her construct since before the stroke, and I understood, hearing it, that some of her recovery had been about more than just words finding their way back to her. Some of it had been about finally having a reason to use them fully again. Grant never apologized, not the way I'd once imagined he might, in some cinematic version of this story, where the courtroom scene ends with him breaking down and admitting everything. What he did, instead, was smaller and, in its way, more honest. He showed up to Sunday dinner 4 months after the hearing, sat at the same end of the table he'd always sat at, and asked our mother, out loud, in front of me, whether she needed anything from the pharmacy that week. The first time, that I could remember, that he had ever asked the actual logistical question instead of assuming someone else already had it handled. It wasn't an apology, it wasn't nothing either. I let it be exactly the size it actually was, instead of making it either bigger or smaller than that, to suit whatever ending I might have wanted for this story. I did not become the family's hero. I want to be honest about that, because I know how satisfying it would be to tell you I did. I became, instead, something quieter and, I think, more useful. The person whose help now came with a name attached to it, a set of terms, a signature that meant what it said instead of one that simply appeared, unremarked, at the bottom of whatever needed handling. When my mother needed a ride to a follow-up appointment now, Grant asked me directly, instead of assuming, and I said yes or no based on my actual schedule instead of an old, unspoken obligation that had never once been formally negotiated between any of us. When a cousin's mother had a health scare that winter, and someone in the family finally, awkwardly, asked whether her paperwork was in order, I was the one they called, and I helped, gladly, because it turns out protecting people you love and refusing to be quietly used by them were never actually in conflict. I had just spent a decade believing they were the same risk. I did not become cold. I want that understood clearly, because I know documentation and boundaries can sound, from the outside, like a woman who simply stopped feeling things and started filing them instead. I became, I think, clear, which is a different thing entirely, and took me considerably longer to learn than any legal document ever could have. I still cried at my mother's kitchen table sometimes, over ordinary things, the way I always had. I still drove the 40 minutes every other Sunday. I just did it now as someone who had proven, to herself first and to everyone else second, that being needed and being seen had never actually been the same thing, and that a family finding out the difference, however painfully, was not the tragedy anyone had originally framed it as. It was, in the end, simply the truth, arriving later than it should have, in the only form my family had ever really been willing to accept it, written down, signed, and impossible to argue with. So if you are the one in your family who quietly keeps the folder nobody else thinks to start, the one who remembers the pharmacy's generic brand switched again, who drives the 40 minutes, who gets called reliable right up until the moment reliability becomes inconvenient to somebody else's plans, I want you to hear this clearly. Being trusted with the fine print is not a small role in anyone's life. It is not the consolation prize for not being the favorite. Sometimes, it is simply the truest form love ever took in your family, arriving quietly, years before anyone needed to say it out loud, sitting in a drawer, waiting for the one day it would matter more than anything anyone ever said at a dinner table. Being loved and being authorized are not the same thing, And it took almost losing both to teach me that they don't have to be, that you can hold someone's whole trust without ever needing to hold it over them, and that keeping the record of your own quiet years isn't bitterness. It's simply the thing that lets the truth speak later, clearly, in a room full of people who would rather it hadn't. What would you have done if you found out the person who called you not stable enough to be in charge had never actually been in charge of anything at all? Tell me in the comments. I still wonder, some nights, whether I'd have found the courage to walk into that credit union if I hadn't already spent 6 years quietly being the kind of person who keeps the paperwork, just in case. This story is a work of fiction. Any resemblance to real people, events, or families is coincidental. If you take one thing from it, let it be this. Protecting the people you love, quietly and on paper, is never something you should have to apologize for.